In the last section, we hooked up our input in the search bar to the component state. By updating the state, whenever the change event occurred, we caused the entire component to re-render. Remember, and I'm going to say this for probably the 5th time now, we only update our state by calling this.setState. The only time that we ever manually change it with something like this.state equals is inside of the constructor. In this section, we're going to take the idea of state one step further by creating what's called a controlled field, or a controlled input, a controlled form element. A controlled field is a form element, like an input, whose value is set by the state rather than the other way around. So think about it for a second. Think about like the kind of sequence of events that we've witnessed so far. Right now, whenever our input changes, it causes the state to be updated, right? Our input tells the state what it should be. That's the key here. The input changing tells the state, hey, you need to change. You can imagine that there's one Shirley guy right here, input, trying to tell his boss, state, hey, you need to change. I'm not gonna change, you should. In the ideal world, it should really be the other way around. The state should tell the input what the current value should be. Let's update our text input to get its value from the state, and then we're going to talk about what the implications of this approach are and why we want to do it this way at all. So the update is really straightforward. I'm going to break the input tag into some separate lines here, and we're going to add another property here. We're going to say value equals this.state.term. Okay, I'm going to refresh the browser now. And I'm going to type something. And it looks like, hey, it still works. Everything's the same, right? Nothing's really changed here. So did anything really change? Well, let's check. I'm going to take the onChange property, and I'm just going to delete all of it. So I still have the closing input tag here. Don't delete that. I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh. And now I'm in the input, and I'm trying to type, and nothing's happening. You could probably even hear my keyboard in the background. I'm really pounding on the keyboard here. So big difference. Can't type anything at all, right? So what's happening? Well, I'm going to Control-Z, get our onChange back here and save it just to make sure we got that. So what's happening here? First, remember to undo that deleted line here. So here's what's going on. When we tell the input that its value is provided by this.state.term, we turn it into what's called a controlled component. So input right here is now a controlled component, a controlled form element. A controlled component has its value set by state. So its value only ever changes when the state changes. So remember before we had input saying, hey state, you need to update. I'm not going to update, you need to update. When we go into this type of controlled form or controlled form element, controlled input, it's the other way around. The input changes. It still tells the state, hey, here's my new value. Here's what the change was. But rather than the input saying like, okay, here's what that value is, and my value is that too, it's the other way around. This.setState causes the component to re-render, and when it re-renders, the value of the input is set to the new value of this.state.term. So let's go through the flow, the order of operations here. Our app starts up and renders an instance of search bar. Over in search bar, we get a new instance of it created, and so the constructor is called, and this.state.term is set to an empty string. So term is an empty string. The component renders. The value of the input is set to retrieve its value from this.state.term. So its initial value is an empty string. And we start off totally empty. So the component then sits around for a little bit, it's render on the page, whatever, waiting until the user enters some text. When the user enters some text, the state is updated to this.state.term is set equal to the changed text value. At that point in time, the value of the input has not changed. That's the key. When this onChange handler right here runs, the value of the input has not actually changed. We've only called the input handler the event handler with the new event, or excuse me, with the new value right here. The event handler runs, updating this.state.term to be that new value. Whenever setState is called, our component immediately re-renders. So when the render function is called again, the value of the input is updated to receive the new value of this.state.term. Finally, the component finishes rendering, and the new value of the input is then visible on the screen. So the real key there, the real jump-in logic, is that when a user types something, they didn't actually change the input value. They only triggered an event. And because we updated the state with that event, that causes the value of the input to change. Okay, so that's all. That's the super confusing loop-de-loop crazy part. You're probably sitting there saying, what the heck is the difference here? What's the value of this? What's this doing for us? Well, in terms of React, this is really how we treat data, right? We don't we don't have a kind of imperative flow of data throughout our application. We don't say, hey, the user changed something, I need to go figure out what the value is, right? It's a much more declarative syntax. We say the value of the input is equal to the state. In a more general term of trying to answer the question, why is this useful for us? Well, it allows us to do a lot more very useful things. For example, let's say that we want to have some default input inside the input. We don't, not a placeholder, not like a grayed out text that goes away when the user clicks there. We want to have like an actual value pre-populated there. So I'll say starting value as our initial state. Now I'll save this, refresh it, and you'll see that I get this initial starting value here, and I can go ahead and change it. So it allows us to do stuff like that very easily. It also allows us to read the value out of the input much more easily than if we had if we were, say, using jQuery. Let's say that we had some button inside of this component, and we wanted to read the value of the input whenever the user clicks the button. Instead of doing something like, okay, let's use jQuery to find the input and then read the value out of it. Instead of doing that, which is kind of, it's a hassle, we can just say this.state.term. And we always know that's the correct value of the input at any given time. So I know this has been pretty confusing, but this is, the controlled component stuff is probably the most challenging aspect of state. We're going to be using controlled inputs, controlled components a lot throughout this entire course. So if it's still confusing right now, don't sweat it. We're going to cover it several times. Okay. So that's enough on state for now. Let's continue in the next section.